Hey, I am in Korea right now, hence why I've got this background because I'm hanging out in my nephew's room. I'm going to try and do a bit more videos whilst I'm over here, maybe out by the mountains or in the park where I do my morning training. And since doing the training every day, which is what I always do, there are normally realizations that happen after the training and also in times of reflection when journaling about the training experience afterwards. And that's what this talk is about. This one is about force generation. So it's mostly focused on the martial arts component of Wing Chun. And if we look at force generation and we take a couple of terms from Chinese, there are two kind of key words there, one being li and the other being qi, depending on the dialect and that sort of thing. But let's go through them because it's really important that you understand these, because when you get up every day and train, or you are training, you should have a set objective. So me personally, I have a syllabus that I train against, and I map that out for a 3 to 6 month period, and then I train that through. I assess what I achieved out of doing that training and pressure test it. And if anything didn't work, for example, which is like the worst case scenario, then if that thing doesn't work, then either you're training it incorrectly or your understanding of it's incorrect, or maybe that thing just does not work. And that is extremely important in Wing Chun, considering with all the literature I've read on the topic, I'd have to say that none of it, except a really small minority, did I find useful. And then other parts of it seem to be, just embellishments, historical stories about Ingmoy and the ancestors and all of these sort of things that could easily just be fabricated. And nonetheless, what's that got to do with the martial art, with you defending yourself in a sort of dire situation? So these talks are to be much more pragmatic. And the other part is the course I have online is organized in uh, categories that the student can learn about qigong for meditation and healing. And then what has that got to do with martial arts? Especially with all the fakery of some no-touch things that I've seen on the web and stuff that really just makes me laugh, but also has me concerned that there's people who get suckered into those things and believe in it. So I'm hoping that this talk on these two words, Li and Qi, helps sort of clarify some things and allows you to, if you've got a syllabus or your training, you can set up your training in such a way that you're working on these components and working towards something. So let's start with Li. It is muscular force. So it's something that should not really be foreign to anyone. Anyone who goes to the gym and does weight training, that's you working on Li. And when you do weight training, you have to look at it from the perspective of your martial art, because there would be a way that you train that to generate force. And what sort of force is it? Are you generating it via a strike with your fists? Are you doing an open hand palm strike? Are you doing an elbow strike, shoulder strike? Are you doing a strike with your knee or with your foot, right? So there are all these questions you should be asking yourself and weighing up as to the type of exercise that you're doing with weight training and why you're doing that for your martial art. There's a popular post going around now with Bruce Lee's weight training regime, and you can see the research that he did, that he's specifically targeting a lot of areas within his body to be able to generate the force uh, that he could, right? And so a lot of his training is what we'd call Lee based, and there are certain biomechanics and structures within his body that he is using as his engine to generate force, and that was his style. Um, and that style is, sort of lives on in Jeet Kune Do. Now, we also have another sort of component to that with his training, because he had free weights that, where he would have movements, and then he would have like a static weight set where there would be, say, a bar with a chain to the floor, right? Or it's a bar with so much weight that it's almost impossible to lift. And so what he would do is he would then stress his body lifting that, and but hold that static position. Now, this is different in that it's not just working the muscles, it's focusing more on the tendons, right, and joints. And just as muscular exercise, it doesn't not it work your joints and tendons. Otherwise, how do people get injured and so forth, right? But its focus is on the muscle. So if you have a clear dissection of those and you apply that to your training, I think you can get a much greater output in what you're trying to achieve if you apply that logic to it. Now, in the same way that, say, if someone went to a boxing gym and the instructor taught them how to throw maybe a jab and then a cross, and they learn that technique, and then they learn how the footwork goes with it and how they use their waist and hips and so forth. They then sort of practice that maybe on the heavy bag, and then they'll jump in and do a bit of sparring to see if they can accomplish that on a moving target. What we have here is just a really well-defined set of steps, starting from actually knowing the technique, and then this diligent practice that you can do in shadow boxing, like free open form, like how we have open forms, and then pressure testing on the bag, seeing if you can generate power with it, and then trying it on when somebody's moving, and then also attacking you back. So and there's a lot to be said about that system, considering if we look at the mixed martial arts, a lot of it consists of boxing, kickboxing, and jiu-jitsu. Right? It's kind of you've got the what you could say is a long fist, short fist, close range, and then groundwork. Right? So the MMA has covered all of those areas. And if we have a look at, let's see if I can bring his name up, Zhu Xiaodong, hopefully I pronounced that right. He's that Chinese gentleman who has been going around China and calling out fake Tai Chi masters. And so he's a really good, scientific example of somebody who is purely training Li and going against these Tai Chi masters who would be purely focused on Ji. Okay. And we can already see the end result. And it's not just Tai Chi masters, there's a Wing Chun dude in there as well, and there's other people. And he is annihilating them. Now, his proficiency in MMA isn't that high, but he's demolishing these other schools who are probably embellished too much in culture and in philosophy and areas that just are not producing the results required. in the martial context. Now, does that mean the theories of those internal schools are all nonsensical and they just were all wrong and all? It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that those teachers' ideas of all of those things are wrong, right? So you've got to bring it down then to yourself and looking at, well, what are your ideas? Were they similar to those guys? Are you doing the same training as them? And if you come up against someone like him, is that the same result? And we can see a lot of schools, which is good, by the way, from what's occurred from mixed martial arts over the last decade or so, that they're bringing back in more pressure testing. And you will see things, or hopefully you can pick up that when they do demonstrations and someone throws a straight punch and they statically stand there and then they can do these techniques and all that sort of stuff. Sure, it works with a student and the teacher who they're respecting and they're showing that technique. But does it work in a real context? And how can you get it to that real context via pressure testing and sparring? This is extremely important in if you're going to be setting up your syllabus and you're doing this force generation, you have to have that mindset. Well, am I getting stronger? Am I getting that force generation? And then also the same context, am I eliminating misconceptions? So I think there's a lot to be said about G. And my personal approach is the combination of two. Sometimes using one, sometimes using the other, sometimes using both at the same time. But you need to have that understanding as the boxer does, as they get in and they get taught the technique, they know what it is, then they can practice it with, after much hours of practice, then they can actually apply it. So if you never get that initial understanding, you can never go along that path. There's no causation chain for you to get there. And you end up in, I don't know, philosophical rants, maybe on the internet, or too long of a discussion over the Yamcha table, when you should just be training, and sometimes just training the basics, which is a lot to be said with that. So with G itself, I see it as or translate it as like kinetic force. Now, there are different types of engines you can use in generating this force. And the first time I was taught this, probably over a decade ago now, my teacher said to me, Nai Jin, or it's inch force, right? And this is an explosive force that can be generated at close range. And this type of force as well is inherent in Wing Chun. And one of the things is I don't really see a lot of it. I kind of look around to see if other people have been taught how I'd been taught, and I just don't see it. I don't want to be calling out other schools, but there is another Wing Chun school that they do a type of force generation. And I've visited that school and trained in that. And that's also a type of Jin. But the engine of how it's done is different to this Naijin that I've described, of this inch force and the way it's generated. And so there is also cases that I've met teachers who do Tai Chi, and I look at their force generation and we talk about that. And they, or not those teachers, but when I look at some of those schools, there's sometimes these hot topics about you can't use Li, it just has to be G and all this sort of stuff. I think what really matters is if you look at the example I gave you about Zhu Xiaodong, hopefully that's his name right again, does it matter if you're going to be the winner not so much about winning and losing, but more about getting your head smacked in. Does it really matter, right? What's what's your end objective? And so there is a piece here. If you train the muscles in such a way with Lee, sure, it makes you strong, and it's necessary in the professional fighting. You can't meet any professional fighter and go, oh, you don't lift weights. Of course they do, right? So, and we already know from sports science, it's very healthy for you, and multiple other areas like that. So it should be something that is included. I think people who talk about it not being included, if they were specifically talking about bodybuilding and where your muscles get so puffed up that the person can, gets very rigid, then I understand. Then it's very difficult to generate this gym force. But if you have a muscular stature and you're flexible, then of course you can still do the gym force. And so they're not mutually exclusive in that way. And I think that's very important because that's a misunderstanding I've seen. And also these people tend to get like, fat and lazy, and you're not focusing on any cardio, or they're not focusing on this type of Lee strength training. I think that's very unbalanced, right? So hence why I'm calling these pieces out, so you can identify, well, which parts are in my training, and what's my objective. And if you listed those out, you could see what's missing. The other is you could list out and then put definitions next to it. Okay, Lee, muscular force. In order to generate that, I have to break down the muscle tissue. As it recovers, it builds more muscular cells, and this builds muscle mass, and hence I get stronger. So you have an understanding of what that is. If you have that understanding, well, how do I train that? Okay, good. And then you take G, for example. Do you know what it is? There isn't just one type. So which type are you working with, right? So I'll give a couple of hints here. If you look at nearly all of the internal arts from Asia, I don't want to say all because I can't clearly say I've met everybody in the world, right? But from what I've seen, they are all based on the lower dantian as a core component of their Jin force generation. Okay. So if you're training and thinking you're doing internal, and you are not familiar at all with what the dantian, lower dantian is, and how it's worked and how it can be applied, then you're not doing internal training. I'm going to be very absolute in that, and people can criticize or do whatever, but that's my understanding based on my definitions of it. So there are other components as well about using the Ming Men, or using dantian, or using the joints, or using your body mass. So all of these can be different variables in creating different types of Jin or Qi. So I'm not going to lay out all of them for you. These videos are more to raise questions to see if you know what they are. Have you got it figured out? Because if you've got it figured out, then you can set up your own training program and you can work towards those things. But if this is all foreign to you, then of course you don't know what it is, and you're not training those things, right? I think it'd be difficult that you got a technique and you don't know the theory or how to do it, and you're just doing that technique and get the right outcome. It doesn't work that way. You really must have that understanding in your mind. And with that understanding, you can then translate that through your yi, or your intention, in the movements of your body to create that quality that you're after. Is it a Li quality? Is it a Ji quality? What type of Ji is it? Do you know that specificity? Are you sometimes using them one or the other? Do you only stick to one side? Do you sometimes combine both in one technique? all of these things should be digested and thoroughly understood by the student so they're trained correctly, and then they can at least, punch their way out of a wet paper bag, for instance. As well as an old saying from the Chinese is, if you practice the martial arts without learning the internal, then you grow old and become empty. Right? So I also made this video because if people are practicing Wing Chun and your only understanding of fourth generation is lifting weights, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I'm letting you know you're leaving things on the table. And there are other types of fourth generation. And these ones are quite interesting because as you grow older, these can only improve because they're not based on these larger muscle groups, which we can see in older people start to deteriorate. Of course, there are some freaks of nature, very rare. You might see on the internet, it's like this 75-year-old guy, look how muscular he is because he does blah, blah, blah. But you don't have like hundreds of them or tens of them even running around. They're just like a unique case. So we can just say, on the whole, as you get older, these muscles deteriorate over time and you get weaker. Now that's the Li force. There is also this G force that as you get older, that force itself doesn't deteriorate in the same way. And there is the potential there that it just keeps on improving to allow you to maintain a great state of health so you can get up and train all the way into old age, even maybe the day that you die. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope that helps sort of clarify some of these fourth generation terminology. And if you have any questions, please pop them in the comments below, and I'm happy to make sort of videos on those. But otherwise, if it's all sort of foreign, you're looking to learn these things, please come check out the course Wing Chun Qigong online. And we've got programs set up where it steps the student through in this very logical fashion, taking them from the beginner to the medium to the advanced stages. All right. Thanks again.